lives, that kind of thing. We're also talking about their faith during that time. Some guys went in as Christians and talk about living with their faith in a military environment. And some guys become good Christians later on and can look back and know that God was there with them, even though there were times that they didn't ask Him to be, that kind of thing. So, if you would, just kind of start us off with where you were just before you got into the military.
Okay. I was in college, grew up in St. Louis, was in St. Louis University, and chose after 2 years to abort the college education, at least temporarily, and volunteered for the draft and went away in January of 1954. In the Army, went to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, just outside Fort Smith at that time, to take basic training. Was there for 13 or 14 weeks, whatever it was at the time. And after graduating from basic, was assigned to a radar school, really, at Fort Bliss, Texas, and spent 8 months down there. I was a pretty wild youngster in those days. I was 20 years old and having a good time. Was not saved at the time. And went through that, was sent overseas in January of 1955. Shipped to Germany and then reassigned to an Air Force base in England. Neglected to say that during the radar school training, I was trained on an anti-aircraft gun, radar-controlled anti-aircraft gun. And so we were assigned to a SAC base in East Anglia to defend the Air Force from what we thought might be Russians or whoever at the time. Of course, Korea was just in the winding down stages then. I think the truce had already been signed and all that. So we sat over there and kind of guarded the Air Force. Again, I was a radar technician. There were 2 of us in this battery of 5 guns. And we did repair work and routine maintenance and that sort of thing. Again, pretty quiet time. We would get called out in the middle of the night sometimes when the long-range radar would find an airplane that they couldn't identify. So we went out, started generators, loaded guns, and waited till they told us, "Hey, yeah, we know who it is, so go back to sleep." And that was pretty much my military career. Nothing real exciting. Was with a pretty wild bunch of fellas. And we should have gotten in trouble, I suppose, but didn't. I guess, looking back at my faith during those times, I had been off and on in a Baptist church in South St. Louis, and my high school years, my dad was on the road all the time, so when he came home, they didn't go to church, and I didn't either. One thing that I'll always remember is that while we were at Fort Smith and I was in basic, we got a pass one weekend and went to town and just happened to be in a hardware store. And the man that ran the hardware store was a Baptist and a dedicated Christian, and he invited 3 of us to go to church with him the next day. So we did, and he fed us lunch and just treated us like home folks, which for me was kind of unusual. But I've always remembered that. And overseas, we didn't have much opportunity. Again, I was in an Army detachment on an Air Force base. We had no chaplain. So we spent our time in town partying primarily. And it wasn't till long after that that I looked back and thought about those folks in Arkansas and got myself involved with Green Acres Baptist Church. Was really the next experience for me, and that was in 1979. So I've been a member here since then, happy member. I was 45 years old the day I was saved, and looking back, I can see the Lord working in different ways. The college I went to was a Catholic college, and I learned a lot about their ways and faith doing that, and it's really not all that different from what we believe. They're more ritualistic and so forth, but when it gets down to the bottom line of Jesus Christ and Him risen, they believe that just as much as we do. So that pretty much covers that stage of my life.
Mr. Evans, let's kind of go back and talk about just getting into the military. You're just now going to basic and everything. What's the first experience that stands out in your mind as going, oh boy, this is what military life is?
Well, I guess the first day, we went through an induction center there in St. Louis, and they put us on a bus, and we went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, to spend the first night. And it was in an old temporary barrack that had been built during World War II. And they gave us blankets and sheets and a cot, you know. Turned the lights off at 9 o'clock, and the next morning we were up at, 5 o'clock probably. Had to mop the floors and make the beds and all that. And my mother had always done that for me, so it was a rapid change. And then I guess that was the first impression, if you will, and it went from there and kind of in the same direction.
In a big hurry too,
I'm sure. Wintertime.
What kind of changes did you find in yourself from who you were when you went into the military to going overseas and then coming back home?
I guess I became a lot more independent. I had lived at home, all my life, and had really depended on my folks for my livelihood and so forth. And when I came back, that was all different. While I went back and stayed in their house for a year or so after I got back, it wasn't the same. It was, I was grown up. I had been away and found that I could exist away from home. And so I began to kind of plot what I wanted to do with my life, and knew that I wasn't going to stay in that house, not because I didn't like my mother and dad, but simply because I felt like I should make my own way.
You feel like going into the military helped you be more prepared for that kind of?
Absolutely. There was a sense of pride to it. Back then, nobody threw eggs at servicemen. We were respected and felt like we were doing something for our country. We were accepted in England, where I spent a year, as those Americans. They were 9 years out of World War II, and they remembered all the Air Force guys and Army guys that had been there during that war, and they were impressed. They were our friends. They really were. And that was a great experience as well.
So, you talk about being over there in England and with those anti-aircraft guns, and in the middle of the night they'd come through with some kind of a call battle station kind of thing, and you run out, load it up, get everything ready. Is that kind of nerve-wracking and kind of hair-raising to have to do that? And
The first few times. Once we figured out that all of them were false alarms, and we had a very long-range radar on the base, and it was getting out, 200 or 300 miles, and almost always what it was a private airplane that hadn't bothered to tell anybody where it was going or something like that. So after the first 2 or 3 times, then it wasn't so exciting anymore.
you have to be like the boy cried wolf or something.
Kind of like that. We nearly wore out our ammunition loading and unloading guns, but
What was it like to be away from home for that kind of stretch?
I was ready for that. I'd been kept on a pretty close rein, I guess, at home, and being able to go and do, of course, once I was off duty, the Army's doesn't let you run too loose, but while I was in radar school and overseas, I carried a pass, so if I wasn't on duty, I could go wherever I wanted to within limits. But it was a new experience for me and a good experience. I enjoyed being away and being independent. And it was a carefree time, too, with no family of my own to worry about. I had a pretty good time. I really did.
How long were you in England?
About a year, a little over a year.
After your time over there, were you turned loose, or did they have something else for you to do?
No, that was turned loose. I was drafted for 2 years. And so when I left there, I came back, went to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and mustered out in January of '56.
What was that like to get to come back home? England's not too different, I guess, compared to some other places in the world to have to get sent to, but it's still not America. It's still not home.
No, but it's amazingly close, back then anyway. Of course, the language was the same. We ate about the same kinds of things, and it was like being in another city in the United States, again, at that time.
Sure.
I'm sure I know it's changed since then, but I enjoyed it. It was an experience that I would never gotten any other way. And I'm a firm believer that all the young men ought to do that. I was disappointed when they dropped the draft. Not because I think it's something that, it's not a penal colony kind of a thing. And I think people look at it that way, but it's really not. It kind of lets you see what's going on in the rest of the world. And I worry about the status of our armed forces today because, number one, there aren't enough of them, So, anyway, it was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything.
Let's talk about, you talk about the differences in the military during that day and the military now, and let's talk about Americans and patriotism and support for the military, for our country, and love of the flag during that time, and compared to today's kind of rebuilding, wavering patriotism, sort of. I hate to put a label on it, but I call it bandwagon patriotism since the terrorist attacks last year.
There's a lot of that. Of course, back in my time, again, we were 8 or 9 years out of World War II, just months out of Korea. And people felt pretty strongly. I remember during World War II, when I was 11, 12, 13 years old, being a little afraid because we had the Germans and the Japanese And they made some pretty strong inroads before we finally turned it around. And I know my mother was terribly afraid during that time. And now, up until 9/11 anyway, this country really hadn't faced anything that menacing, if you will, in, 30, 40 years. And I think we got complacent. We were the strongest nation in the world, and, nobody better fool with us. But the 9/11 kind of woke some of us up, woke a lot of us up, I guess. But like you said, there's some bandwagon patriotism out there, and it didn't take long for that to fade. And now we've got people parading in Washington, anti-war folks, and it sounds like Vietnam all over again. So, I guess in the sense of love of country, people love their country as long as it doesn't cost them anything. Kind of the way I look at it. I fault Hollywood for a lot of that because they advertise, they're heard all over the world, and they live in kind of a little dream world out there, so that's a problem. Maybe the nation can't stand prosperity. I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but we do get complacent no matter what, and that's a problem that's going to be dealt with somehow.
Yeah, the scary thing to think about is it may not be us that does the dealing with it. Somebody's liable to have enough of that one day and then turn it over on top of us. You wonder about, will America be able to take it? I don't know with the way people think now and the way.
Well, I feel like that in the face of a real threat, a real tangible, can put your hands on it threat, the average American will stand up and be counted. There'll be the whiners and the complainers, and but that was the case, always been the case. And I think if this nation perceives a serious threat, I grew up in the country and everybody had a shotgun beside the front door, and it would be a formidable thing to take on this nation. I don't know that anybody could do it in a frontal kind of a thing. It would have to be a sneak attack of the 9/11 sort. You worry about biological weapons and all that sort of thing, and that's a real concern. But I think we have the wherewithal to deal with it if we just don't go to sleep again and don't politicize it. I guess that discourages me more than anything.
Me too. I can't stand to sit there and watch them all fuss and fight.
Yeah, and it's an election year, so there's a lot more posturing than there would be normally.
Oh yeah, strut their feathers and blow their horns.
Yep.
All that kind of stuff. Mr. Evans, we'll kind of wrap it up here with Attorney Lee. Talking about what God's doing in your life now. He brought you through the military.
Mm-hmm.
The military could have told you to do anything. They could have sent you anywhere.
Yes.
And God saw fit to bring you through in the way that He did, and He's got you now here. What's He doing in your life now?
He's teaching me. I'm a Sunday school director, and I participate in the intercessory prayer ministry and work with the United Way organization and do things of that sort. And I'm still learning. I'm a child as far as the scriptures are concerned. I learn every week in Sunday school just like everybody else does. He taught me to accept Jesus as my Savior 25 years ago or so. And it's been a learning, growing experience for me since. I've developed a lot of Christian friends, and we have a little men's prayer group that meets once a week when we can. And so it's the little things. I'm not involved in any earth-shaking ministries of any kind. But I've gotten my 4 kids baptized and saved along the way, and starting on the grandkids now, so that's an accomplishment as well.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it is. That's a happy and wonderful accomplishment.
Yep.
There's a lot of people who wish they could have that much, but and it's a wonderful thing to be able to know and to give God credit for that kind of thing in your life. Mr. Evans, I'll turn you loose.
Okay.
Next thing I know, we've already spent 30 minutes down here, and